Thank you, all three presenters. So we've listened to three presentations. Baba, from their preliminary analysis, presented on the effect of biofortified wheat on zinc. As he indicated in the presentation, they are awaiting further analysis, but you may have questions, you may have clarifications that you need. Nicola Lowe is here and would answer questions related to the first presentation. The second presentation by Pepeng indicated that integrated home gardening interventions can be impactful in improving dietary diversity. And the third presentation by Sunita, as she just indicated, is that nutrition sensitive agriculture programs are only sensitive if they are sensitive to gender issues as well. And so at this stage, can we have questions, clarifications for the three presenters? So 5 minutes and we'll have the second batch of presentations.
Thanks. I'm Anna Herforth. My question is for Pepin. Thanks for the presentation on sustainability of interventions, really important. And I had a comment and a question related to observations of working in Bangladesh on this issue, where Chetina Mirle several years ago did an analysis of farmers in Bangladesh stopped growing perishable vegetables when a bridge was out that enabled getting to market. Because even if they're primarily for home consumption, farmers want to be able to sell any excess that comes from any land that's used on cropping. And by contrast, the cucurbits and the gourds seem to be sustained, which are very non-perishable as vegetables go, and people can store them for many weeks at a time. So I was wondering if the home gardens interventions had any component of market linkages, or if that could be possible as something for the future.
Okay. Can we get a few more questions and then they would address them together?
Thank you very much. My name is Inge Brouwer from Wageningen University in A4NH. I also have a question for Pepijn. You introduced the three questions you had, nutrition status and scaling out and sustainability. I think there's a fourth question on what is actually the contribution to the total vegetable intake. And if I look at your data, there are two strange things I see. You presented after 3 years the intake of the control group, which was far or was above 200 grams per day per capita, if I'm right. So what could be the reason for that? Is there a spillover effect maybe? And second is if they eat 200 grams per day, it means they need 73 kilograms per year. And if I look at your production, it was about 25. I'm not completely sure, so it's a very little contribution. And so where did these other vegetables that they consume, where is it coming from?
Are there other questions, clarifications or comments? Okay, if none, no further questions at this stage. Okay, I think there's a question at the back. Okay, so can you please address these two and then we'll come.
Thank you for those questions. Now, as part of the home garden intervention, we typically tell women, because we only target women in these interventions, to preferably consume the vegetables. So we kind of a little bit discouraged to sell vegetables. And what we find in the intervention also that only about 5% of the vegetables produced are being sold by those women. That we tell them, like, you consume what you can, and what you cannot consume you share with your neighbors. That's what we want to achieve. Actually, there's a good research question in itself, because we would like to know this income effect of home gardens and the potential effect on nutrition. It's still one of those open research questions. I think they could also be added to the fourth question, that we don't know exactly. How much should we encourage selling versus like own consumption? So the second question about there's some discrepancy potentially in the data, but the consumption data are based on a 24-hour recall. and the production data are based on a 2 times 6 months recall, so 12-month recall. So it's difficult to match those two. Of course, we know that there's a lot of variation in terms of consumption and production levels between within a year. So that the consumption data maybe show higher, actually, that cannot be extrapolated to 365 days. That's the problem. That's what I see there. Thank you.
Are there other questions for the first 50% of the presentation? We have 3 more presentations to come. Are there questions on the first 3? Okay.
Sunita, I want to know how is land ownership, how the land ownership has some relationship with energy expenditure in case of women.
Are there other questions? Okay, so I have one for Nicola, a question related to Baba's presentation. So you aimed to confirm whether or not consuming biofortified wheat would impact women's zinc status. Of course, we know what is in biofortified wheat, and the preliminary analysis at this stage doesn't seem to show that it is impactful on their zinc status. Were you surprised at the findings, or are you surprised at your findings at this stage? Are there other questions? Maybe one more, and then we can move to the second batch. Okay, so if no, you can address this.
Ronali, she's on the study. So, no, I haven't sent her. As I said, it is preliminary, and I was trying to finish it only last night, so she didn't get to see it. But, so what we find is that land is actually not, this is a question that is related to BMI as an indicator, as the outcome indicator. So we actually don't see an association between land and BMI, but we do see an association between land and agriculture variables and women's decision making, but a negative association of these variables with BMI. So we are thinking, okay, people with land may be able to produce more, but it's really not negatively associated with BMI, probably because women may be working more. Women are making more decisions because land is associated with women's decisions in agriculture. Women might be taking more decisions. That could also mean that I take the decision and I'm expected to work on it. So obviously we have time use data, so we looked at workload to see if there are any threshold effects, so on and so forth. And what we find is that actually the results don't change even if you adjust for workload. But workload as measured by time use data. So maybe the kind of data we are collecting as a proxy for energy expenditure, which is a workload time use data, maybe is not good enough. We really do need solid expenditure data, which is why probably we need to invest in that. And there were learning labs on how to improve those estimates, and probably that's the way we need to go to get better answers, more precise answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, and thank you everybody for listening to Baba's presentation. I know it was a bit difficult to hear. We wanted to give him a chance to present. He couldn't come because of visa issues because he's from Pakistan. Just to answer your question, I guess we were not surprised. I think anybody who's involved in the field of zinc and measuring zinc status will be well aware that we don't have any really good biomarkers for zinc status. Plasma zinc is the most commonly used and arguably the best we've got. And in addition to that, we calculated the amount of additional zinc that women would be receiving through consuming the biofortified flour, and it came to around 3 milligrams a day. Bearing in mind the high vegetable-based diet, the bioavailability of that zinc is going to be very, very low. So we're probably looking at an additional zinc intake of less than 1 milligram a day. So for plasma zinc to respond to that would be a tall order, and we weren't really expecting that to happen, particularly over such a short time period for the intervention. However, one of the main points of this research was to evaluate a whole range of other potential biomarkers for zinc status. And Baba put the list up there, which included hair and nail and DNA fragmentation using the COMET assay, and dark adaptation and a few others. So we're still analysing those data, and we're hopeful that possibly we might see some small changes in those biomarkers, but that's yet to be seen. I would like to add also that we are conducting the next phase of this study, which would be a larger scale trial with 500 participants instead of 50, and with the intervention over a longer time period. So we'll be able to evaluate those more fully in the second study that's coming up. But thank you very much.
So we've been treated to very interesting and exciting 6 different presentations. We have had opportunity to ask questions on the first 3. I would want us to take the next 5 minutes to post questions or comments or requests for clarifications to the last 3 presenters. So beginning with this very one, Jeff's presentation and Stella's. So questions from the floor? Okay.
Thanks very much. Another 3 fabulous papers. My question is to Stella. Firstly, I want to thank you for sharing the results. They may not necessarily be that unusual, but what's important is that you've shared them publicly. And so thank you for that. My question relates to your statement that in your study area of Côte d'Ivoire, that chickens tend to be associated with men. I wondered if maybe it was intensively raised chickens were associated with men, and maybe women were more associated with poulet bicyclette. Thank you.
Nutrition education was directed at the women, because if you don't consciously drive nutrition education as to the relevance of raising the chicken, then the men find the advantage in making money. So I would really want to know how much of that nutrition education you give in today, so that it is not just geared towards making money, but also to improve their nutrition.
I'm really sorry, Jeff and Tedeschi. This is another question for Stella. And possibly Pepin might want to comment on it. I really enjoyed looking at those results as well, and I was really curious about the programming implications. Has there been any discussion about whether there's a sort of lighter ongoing support for projects going on like this that would maybe give sustained access to seeds or something along that lines? And then I was also really interested in the switch to the peppers. Obviously, they're a little bit easier to transport and people might get more of a profit from them. Was there any discussion about sort of other products that would also be nutritious but possibly could also have some market advantage for people that they might want to compromise on there?
So can we have one more and then they would address? I do hope we have time, because we have had to do some goalpost shifting. So I hope it benefits us. We started at, yes, good. So we started at 25, so we'll stop at 55. So this question, and then we'll come back.
So I'm Erin Lentz. I've got a question for Jeff. Do you have a sense yet of what your findings are around the different forms of child supplements? So, CSV versus, liquid-based things versus micronutrient powders. And could you share them with us if you do? Thanks.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, everybody, for the really interesting questions. First, just a comment to respond to Robin. Thank you for sharing this work. I'm going to pass on that thank you to the organization, HKI, because I thought it was very courageous of them as an organization that gets a lot of its funding from these type of projects to be open to having one evaluated for sustainability later and to having those results shared publicly. So I have to give a lot of kudos to the organization for doing that, and also to the funder, because this kind of work, it isn't very sexy if you're a funder to support sustainability studies after projects have already ended. So I think a lot of acknowledgement goes to those two parties. And chicken cultivation in Côte d'Ivoire, chicken raising in Côte d'Ivoire. First of all, to say Côte d'Ivoire is a hugely diverse country. From one area to the next, you have massive differences in ethnic groups as well as agroecologies. So that's not a statement that can really apply across all of Côte d'Ivoire. In the particular area where we were focused, it's a very interesting cultural mix with some very strong gender norms and social structures that you don't find in other places in Côte d'Ivoire. And in those places, raising chickens in general was more associated with men. Typically, women would have maybe some chickens, but it would be a majority male occupation. And definitely when it came to the more intensive poultry production, which was associated as being a market activity, that was much more male. So there were some women who had backyard chickens, but still in general, it was considered a male activity within this very particular region of Côte d'Ivoire. In terms of how much nutrition education they received, yeah, I think this is something that you really have to keep hammering in often and keep touching regularly. And there's been a lot of other research that's shown that the frequency with which you contact people with messages about nutrition and just keeping that up over time really matters. Within this project, during the implementation period, everybody was targeted with one group discussion section a month, as well as a home visit, 1 or 2 home visits during the month. That was the target. In reality, that maybe wasn't always reached because it put a lot of burden on community workers to actually reach out and do all of those home visits, but most of the group sessions at least happened. At the same time, those were primarily targeted at, and they were primarily attended by women. So when it comes to household level decision-making, particularly around something like what are we gonna do about these chickens, women might not be the right people to be talking to in those circumstances, and you might need to have more male involvement. At the same time, within this project, we really tried to get men to come, and it was a struggle. A lot of the men didn't feel like nutrition had anything to do with them, and that they had better things to do than to sit and participate in a nutrition discussion section. Let's see. Final one, semi-final one, programming implications, and what does this mean for programming? I think that in the long term, ideally, you want to give some kind of ongoing support, but obviously that can't happen through the project because the project ends, the project has no more money or no more staff. So some of the ways in which you can do that, I think if you have well-functioning agricultural extension services within the country, handing off to that and giving more support, having them provide more support in the long term can be very helpful. To facilitate that through a program, you need to make sure that there's a really strong partnership throughout the program, so you're not bringing them in at the end, but rather they've been there all along. At the same time, the ratio of number of population to number of agricultural extension agents, it's way too high in most of these settings for that to really be a feasible path to doing it. In some areas, I think there's space for private sector providers who can be incentivized to provide some of that support. I think particularly for poultry and for things where there's a bit more value there and there can be a market for somebody like a village vaccinator who can go around to different villages or serve one particular village and give support in an ongoing way. But I think all of those structures, you really need to integrate them into a project from the beginning. Having one system ongoing during a project and then expecting to hand over to another at the end, that's never really going to work. So projects kind of need to begin with the end goal in mind of how are we going to create those structures and how are we going to support them throughout the project and ensure they live on afterwards. Final question for me was about hot pepper. Why hot pepper? Are there other options for crops? One of the things that I glazed over a bit in that is that with hot pepper, it wasn't just that it was a market-oriented crop, it was also that it could be dried. So you could grow it in a season and then you could dry it and then you had a source of income that was much more stable throughout the year. Once the women had already sold crops and converted that into money, it tended to leave really quickly, right? They would spend it themselves or somebody within their household would come to them with a need and that money would be spent. If they instead kept that money stored in something such as dried hot peppers, they could sell a bit over time as they needed it and get money gradually and use that to meet their household needs. So that was one of the particular things about that crop that really made it work for them well. There are some potential opportunities maybe for something that could be a bit more nutrient rich and also fulfill some of those characteristics. If orange flesh sweet potato had a bit more of a developed market in this area, where there is a growing demand for it, it's just not yet as widely recognized. And if the long-term storage techniques were a bit better for that, that could probably be a promising crop. Another one is dark leafy green vegetables. Once they can be solar dried, they're a lot easier to transport and you can sell them for a bit more. And also you can have more stability in income over time. So there's some possibilities there, but when I kind of oversimplified it to being just about market. It was a little more complicated than that, and women had some really good reasons for why they liked growing that.
Okay. So there was a question for Jeff. Was there a question for? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me a question too. So the results on linear growth have been published in the Journal of Nutrition. Diana only is the first author, and it's open access, but I'll tell you what it was anyway. So in the full and the half family ration group, the impact was about 5 percentage point at 1 month, so shortly after birth. And in the MNP group, so the micronutrient powders, it was 4 percentage points reduction. But then when we looked at 24 months, only the impacts in the full and in the MNP group were sustained. So in the full, it was 11 percentage points, and in the MNP group, it was 6.5 percentage points. In the half family ration group, it disappeared. In LNS, interestingly, we didn't find any impact. So some people are not happy with that, but that's just what we found.
Okay, thank you. So maybe 2 more burning questions. Really burning questions. Okay, so we'll see. You have the mic. Please go ahead.
My question is also for Jeff, and I'm wondering if you have any information on what types of other changes might have happened within the family food basket that might have been induced by this benefit that was essentially in addition to already having enough food based on the low food security that you showed. So I'm just wondering, I doubt you collected anthropometry on anybody other than mothers and children, but did you get any anecdotal evidence that other people in the household were also shifting their diets, eating more, or maybe spending money that they would have had to spend on basic foods now on things like Coca-Cola and packaged snacks, and if that might explain some of your findings.
Okay, so is it Jody? Okay. If you are brief, it will be helpful.
Sure. So my question is for Teresa. First of all, thank you for telling us that mosquitoes eat nectar. I think that's the most fascinating thing I've heard. I didn't know that. My question is, how was malaria experience measured? We know it's overdiagnosed in a lot of contexts, so I just wondered how you measured that.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So we didn't measure any other household members, the anthropometry, and in this project did not collect 24-hour recall data. So our insights are limited. Interestingly, what we are happy with is the fact that we had to push a little bit to include women's weight as something we measured throughout the project, because people were like, why on earth would you expect that to change? So we had some idea that that might be a risk, and we're happy we did that, because otherwise it would have gone undocumented. So be on the outlook for unintended effects.
Thank you. I would also happy to be asked. As you said, malaria experience was measured. Initially, we planned to measure using both history and record, but as you know, in low-income settings, record keeping is very poor, so we're not able to validate the reports of mothers. So we relied on the maternal response, whether they have history of malaria or not, but that was a limitation. It's not objective, because mothers may be diagnosed for other reasons and they still can't say we have malaria, but yeah, that was a good question.
Okay, thank you. I know there are still questions out there, but we have spent all the time that was given to us. The presenters are still going to be around, so right after here, those who had questions can interact with them. Since we have spent all the time that was allotted to us, I wouldn't attempt to summarize, but I have a few take-home messages from the presenters. Pepin communicated to us how integrated home gardening could be useful in improving dietary diversity. Sunita's presentation, as I indicated earlier, my take-home message is that we should aim to promote nutrition-sensitive agriculture, but as we do that, we should have gender considerations in mind. And Stella's presentation, I'm pleased and really happy that we are seeing what we are struggling with in ethics or bioethics relating to research waste, where we have researchers do research, get findings, and once the findings are negative, they rest on our shelves. You have been courageous to come out here with your negative findings. It is a take-home message for me. Jeff's clarified his unintended effect from his intervention that as far as I see it, I think those unintended effects could be both negative externalities and positive externalities. That's how I picked it. And so I would want to, at this stage, yes, thank you very much for being very engaging audience and the presenters for being very excellent presenters. So thank you very much.